So Diane, it's very good to have you with us.
Nice to see you.
Diane, would you mind kicking off our conversation about decision making just by giving you a general introduction, who you are and your current role?
Yes, I'm Diane Lees. I am Director General of Imperial War Museums. I've been there since 2008. It still feels like 5 minutes. And I've been in the museum profession for about 35 years. So it has been my entire career. And I have worked in a huge range of organisations, from the Mary Rose project through to collections management projects in the Midlands, etc. So have a broader kind of national experience than perhaps some of the traditional National Museum directors that you would normally expect. So a slightly unusual CV, I think, probably.
Thank you, Diane. So we only have about 20 minutes to dissect our subject of decision making and the influences on it. So perhaps we could start just by inviting you to reflect a little bit from an organisational point of view. Perhaps the IWN, the one that you're running now, or historically, how you put in sort of structures and processes to make sure that decision making happens effectively, I guess, and to make sure that works well.
Yeah. I think it's a really interesting question, because I've worked in a lot of organisations, but I suppose IWM is the most complex because it has 114 buildings, 15 million objects, 600 staff, and it's distributed around the UK. So in a sense that decision making becomes, I think, more complex the more site-based things become. And I think that whole thing around silos is a really interesting thing about decision making, because I think where you've got an organisation that thinks only in terms of a kind of strict hierarchy, you lose the opportunities for good decision making. And also I think you lose the input, the creative input of people that have perhaps a more diverse view of the world or a different set of skills that then influence the way in which you make decisions. So I think in terms of a governance structure, for me, it's really important that however you construct it, that it's based on that cross-departmental working and cross-level working. And it becomes more difficult the kind of larger the scale is. But I think it's really important for staff to understand where those decisions are made as well. So the idea of a very clear governance structure that clearly articulates where decisions are made and who is accountable for those decisions is absolutely critical. And then the kind of counterpoint to that is that a lot of people see accountability or decision making as relying on process. And I think it's really important that process supports the decision making as opposed to kind of abdicates the responsibility for actually making the decisions, which is, you get a tick box. Well, we've had it a long time in our organisation with copyright, which is, if we don't have copyright, we do not use the image, and you tick this box. Whereas actually what we would prefer people to do is to go to say, can we identify the copyright? We really want to use this image. It's really important to the public, and to take that kind of reliance on the process out of it as well. So it's a combination of factors about kind of clarity around your governance structure and making sure the right people have the right conversations at the right time.
Thanks, Diane. So there's a lot you covered in that. So look, a very complex organisation, which obviously adds to the complexity of decision making. I think what I heard you say also is that what you try and avoid is the sort of siloed and hierarchical influences on decision making, because that potentially means that you're not getting the creativity and diversity that you get where you were talking about cross, which is a sort of a horizontal influence or involvement in people in decision making. And you also mentioned this idea of hiding behind the process. So a signature on a box or a tick in a box is not necessarily accountability for a decision, and therefore it's important people understand who ultimately in that complexity is ultimately accountable for our own.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Quite critical points there. Is there when you're thinking about the organisation that you run, is there anything that you're thinking about therefore that gives you some reassurance that those factors are being taken into account about how you organise things, how you structure the process of decision making? You mentioned governance. I mean, what do you do to put stuff in place that makes sure that you're comfortable that those factors are being taken into account in decision making?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting because, of course, most decisions don't get made by leaders. They get made within the organisation and within what frameworks you put in place. So I'm really keen on clarity. so that, you know, sort of where there is guidance in the organisation, or there are processes, that there's kind of clear guidance to staff about those levels of authority. So, for example, in the organisation, there's a rule which is that you can't submit a set of figures for a business case without it being signed off from the finance department. And that sounds like a really simple process, but actually the number of people who will try and convince you that they've got a really good business case for something and the return on investment will be absolutely brilliant, but the finance department will then tell you there's 10 sets of overheads they haven't kind of counted into their budget. So again, it's kind of how the system then backs up the quality of evidence that you get. And so that kind of the authority over the data is quite important as well, in terms of making it clear, you know, who owns that data. So, for example, you know, we have a whole series of kind of, call them empathy checks. It's a really, it fits with our ethical framework and our values base as well, which is the empathy check is the 3D check on what you're looking at. And this is not on kind of, you know, small decisions, because if you're a chief executive, you only get the decisions that nobody else in the organisation wants to make because they're too difficult. So therefore, you're relying on being able to look at all of what's involved in that decision, not from two perspectives, i.e., should we or shouldn't we, but from a three-dimensional perspective, which is, does it fit our brand? Is it something that would impact on us reputationally? Does it meet our ethical standards, et cetera, et cetera? And again, that's where having expertise in the organisation has to work beyond the hierarchy. You have to be able to consult our copyright specialist or our empathy specialist. We don't have an empathy specialist, but you know, that whole thing of using your expertise across levels effectively to ensure that you're making those decisions in the round. And it becomes, I mean, and some of those decisions become more and more complex because, of course, inevitably a lot of the decisions that you make impact on people.
And that in and of itself makes them complex, does it not? So, so there's a couple of things that you mentioned. One is in terms of this sort of like the support mechanisms for effective decision making. The first is making sure that your decisions are based on sound evidence, and that the people who have that evidence and have that expertise have actually signed off to say that indeed the evidence you're basing it on is correct. And you mentioned the finance department having that say, so that you
that's the easy one.
Yes, I'm sure there are less easy than that.
When it comes to ethics and values and all of those other things, that expertise, the application of that expertise becomes a lot more complex.
Right, and that was interesting because you mentioned that you know, the ethics, there's an ethical element to it, there's a brand element. You were talking about that, which of course is entirely related to ethical decision making. So, and those 3Ds that you mentioned, the 3 dimensions of decision making. So, can you perhaps just unpick that a bit more for us, Di, about the ethical dimension of the decision making process? That's where do I mean, if I'm a leader in your organisation, you said, well, not a leader, but somebody's making one of those decisions. You said they're not all referred to you. What do I do to make sure that I've taken full account of ethical questions or brand questions when I'm making a decision?
Well, I think because we have a governance structure that has checkpoints with different bits of the organisation, i.e. the anti-silo strategy, if you like, then actually, as you start to make decisions, there are lots of people that you consult, and you can check. I can check that as a chief executive, because I can look at who's been involved in the email chain. And immediately, because I've been there so long, I can actually go, hang on a minute, they probably haven't talked to so-and-so, and I'd quite like to have those views. And in the organisation, anybody can ask for advice. It's one of our kind of internal values, is that everybody is in service to everybody else. Right.
So regardless of your hierarchy, your particular position or so forth, you have permission to go and approach anybody else. Right, right.
Yeah, and you have permission. I mean, you know, sometimes I regret that, but you know, giving your staff the ability to raise something that either challenges their values or challenges the ethics under which their professional standards sit is absolutely essential. Because I think what happens is, if you have a monoculture, that actually then all of those things can get compromised. I mean, it's the thing that happened in the banking crisis, is that monoculture, you know, sort of overtook the quality of the decision making in that banking crisis. So I think, you know, the idea that a member of staff, regardless of where they are, can say, I feel uncomfortable about this, and they deserve an answer, is part of our kind of internal respect for expertise.
I see. So it allows not ethically questionable decisions, but where ethics is a subject and subject for discussion. It allows an individual to participate.
Yeah.
Actually,
So
I have a point of view about that.
Yeah, so our ethical framework is quite complex because we're a museum, and that comes with a set of specific ethical responsibilities. We sign up to a code of ethics, and then within that, the way we manage our collections, the way that we use our material comes with those ethical standards. And I think the IWM has a whole overlay of ethical responsibilities which are to the people that are in our collections and to their memories. And we're a tri-service museum. A lot of our collections include all of the material with a repository for Ministry of Defence Film and Photography. So all of the base collections from the Ministry of Defence are held by us. And that means that we have a responsibility to care appropriately for people's memories. And that has a whole different set of ethical considerations about the way you choose an image for an exhibition. And then we have all of the safeguarding responsibilities towards both our staff and to the public. So the empathy check becomes the universal application for the organisation in terms of that ethics check. So regardless of whether you're working on an image sale, or whether you're working on a major film project, or whether or not you're just dealing with a freedom of information inquiry, that empathy check is absolutely critical to see all of those different overlaying standards and values applied, with a sensitivity. We are very conscious that people leave some of their most personal memories with us, and that sometimes that material is difficult to handle. So it requires us, for example, to have welfare policies in place for the staff handling the material. So, for example, the staff that are working with the Holocaust galleries at the moment, our new Holocaust galleries project, they have a health and wellbeing coach that works alongside them with that difficult material. So we're not an organisation that is light on wide-ranging emotional intelligence in our people.
Right, I understand. What you mentioned about the empathy check, is that a formal part of your decision-making process, or a bit like you were mentioning a little earlier, the finance check is part of the? Does it have a similar sort of role or position in your process for decision-making, or how does it work?
It's one of our values. So it starts from a values perspective. So we have 4 values. One which is to be courageous with the material, which is a really interesting thing when it comes to some of the critical decisions that we have to make. We have to be an authority, so we have to speak from an evidence base because we're an authority in the subject. We have to be relevant to our audiences and our people, but also then we've added empathy. I mean, it reads as care. It's a really naff marketing kind of brief, and we never say it in those terms, but it's the way I remember it. But the empathy for our audiences, our subjects and our people is our value set, and that fits into people's job descriptions, into our processes. We have an ethics trustee that looks over our empathy value as well, so that there is a scrutiny process to that. So is it a process? No, it's an instinct. And we build that into the way that we train staff internally, etc. It's an instinct always to look at it from all of those different perspectives, and I think it makes IWM quite special in that sense.
It does sound like it. I mean, so you're as a CEO, you can be reassured that when people are making decisions, that they're trained in and they understand that value set, and therefore that will be a core part of their decision-making process, whatever those decisions happen.
Yeah, and I think the difficulty is, I mean, it's really interesting because every organisation has tensions between its different functions, and I think where we found it most difficult is when you start to translate that into our commercial activity, where the drivers are around making money and making profit that support all of the other activities in the museum. And getting that through both delivery and customer service has probably been one of our biggest challenges, because obviously somebody who's got a sales target is going to try to sell. Whereas, so I'll give you an example. So, for example, a member of a family that contacts us because they want a copy of their relations oral history that they've made and is in the museum, Our commercial team will say that will cost you X because it's so many reels, etc. Whereas our empathy should say, and it should at this point, hopefully it'll be corrected by now, but should have said, you can listen to it for free from our website. If you want to own a copy, because we have to, there are costs associated with producing that copy, we ask you to make this contribution to the charity. And I think, you know, those tensions mean that it doesn't always work seamlessly, and it's a constant effort to say, how do we make sure that it permeates those people who are very focused on the fact that they've got to make 100 grand by the end of the month.
Yeah.
And because we live more now on our commercial income than we do on our government granting aid, it's a really interesting tension in the organisation.
Thanks, Di. So often expresses the difference between the tension between value and values, in a sense, isn't it?
Yeah.
Those two things.
Yeah, it's a really good way to describe it. Yeah.
And perhaps one other thing I could just mention, you talked about the importance of clarity of decision making, but also, as you mentioned, that some of the complexities involved. It's often felt that ambiguity has a role to play in decision making, in the sense that many of the decisions, especially particularly that you make, don't avail themselves to clarity, especially when there are sort of ethical considerations there. Could you perhaps just unpick that a bit more for us, Diane, in terms of you know, what you see? You know, do you recognise and sort of call out ambiguity in the decision-making process, and value ambiguity, or as part of it, or what do you do when things are ambiguous?
Do you know, really, it's a really difficult question, because I think, as I said before, as soon as you are a CEO, the decisions that you get are the ones that have massive amounts of ambiguity, right, because you're making decisions that either favour one side or the other. So, you know, and particularly, as I say, with that split between our kind of public work and our commercial work, you know, there is definite ambiguity on who benefits and how you kind of merge those together. So, you know, do I call out ambiguity? No, I think I'm less confrontational in that. I think I would ask questions and say, okay, you're asking me to make this decision. I have a dilemma between, you know, what should be the kind of level of attention to each of the factors that come into that decision. So I'll very often go back and take further advice to try and unpick, you know, what's at the base of the decision. But in my head, there's also, you know, for an experienced leader, there's a lot of, you know, based on previous decisions that you've made, and I have to say gut.
Right.
And I have to say, sometimes that gut instinct that there is some real courage or risk or a really good opportunity is based on the fact that where others in the organisation are not confident to take the risk, I am. Yeah. And I think that where risk plays into that ambiguity is quite an interesting kind of issue, because I think risk registers and things are help people to consider the risks around operations, etc. I'm not sure that a risk register over decisions and ideas is necessarily the kind of right way to go about looking at it.
Right. It's almost like you have a number of almost kind of necessary conditions that allow decision making to be effective, in terms of the evidence-based nature of it, the check against your values, the fact you have a risk register in place. But then, you know, then you've got this almost like final thing, almost like the sufficient condition, which is your instinct or intuition that you rely on in terms of evidence of your own experience. And so, you could describe it as a combination of courage and idiocy, I think.
Really, you know, in a sense, because sometimes I look back on some of the decisions that I've made and think, my God, that was much more risky than I thought it was at the time. So sometimes I just think, you know, oh my God, did I actually make that decision? You know, and in a sense, it's kind of that. Fortunately, I don't think there have been many that have been massively disastrous, because, as I say, we do have all of the things in place, and we have a trustee structure as well. So, you know, we have a governance structure above me that kind of, you know, it has my back and has those checks on those risks. But sometimes I must admit that I think sometimes a little bit of that gut and a bit of naivety have made us braver than perhaps maybe I shouldn't admit to that, but yeah, sometimes I look back and think, oh, okay, you know, that was okay, but in the future you might want to think slightly differently about the way you do it.
Previous conversations, Di, and I have to say, this is something that I really remember from you, that what you do is you do that reflection, correct? I mean, you don't sort of just move on and say, right, that's done. You think back over the stuff that you have done, and you do that quite regularly to say, okay, well, this is what happened. Did it go well? Would I have done something differently? Correct? Is that part of the important process?
It is. It still is,
Right.
Craig, and it's good of you to remember that, because it's a while since we've talked about it. But self-reflection and not in some kind of punishing way has been part of my life over the last 20 years, and I still have the notebooks. I think it's going to make it very easy to write my memoirs, because it's kind of already in the book. But no, I do probably less regularly. So certainly when I was in middle management and those jobs where you take a big step up, it became absolutely essential for me to learn quickly and learn effectively. And so I have a notebook where I reflect on what's gone well, what could have gone differently, reflections on culture. And I think culture in an organization, again, impacts on the quality of the decision making that you feel confident to make. And so those kinds of self-reflections, I think, enable me to kind of go, well, next time I think the questions I would ask would be slightly different. Because the problem is that you can get a lot of data and a lot of evidence, and people can present you with the most, I mean, people are really good at selling things. You know, they can go, this is a great idea, you know, etc. And afterwards you think, actually, the questions I asked were the wrong questions for this kind of decision. And so I think reflecting on that enables you to kind of adapt the way in which you become the kind of investigator on the decision you're being asked to make.
Interesting. And perhaps it also, subconscious or otherwise, allows you to fine-tune your instinct as well. You know, that you're going through that subconscious reflection or even conscious reflection, and that maybe just means that your instinct is also gradually over time being tuned. Because I guess we can never say that our instinct is always spot on. It probably does need refinement.
No, and it comes with all of those biases that are our own culture, our own experience. And, you know, one of the things that I reflected on about not getting old, which I'm still in denial about, is actually what I don't want to be is some of the museum professionals that I saw when I was coming up, which seemed to, you know, the standard response to a new idea is, oh yeah, well, we tried that and it didn't work. And I tried very consciously not to do that, but to let people exploit ideas, because as far as I'm aware, you know, the world has moved on, and in fact, now might be the right time to make that decision and do something in a certain way. So I think that self-reflection helps me to stop becoming a blocker, or to you know, and actually, when you look back at those reflections, I did a paper a while ago for a maritime conference where I was reflecting. I've worked a lot with ships, so I was reflecting a lot on the kind of leadership lessons that I'd learned. And I think it's really interesting to see, as you grow as a leader, that the really importance of not becoming the leader that you didn't like when you were a middle manager. And I think that has helped me kind of keep people feeding into a decision-making process in a more positive way. So they're not afraid of making decisions or making a case or presenting evidence that is difficult, you know, because sometimes things just don't work and we have to make a decision to stop doing them. So I think that self-reflection has been critical. It doesn't make me perfect, and I still can be incredibly, you know, no, I'm not doing that at times. But then again, it's against the background of going, actually, it's not on brand, doesn't fit our ethical, but, you know, it's not in our remit, all of those things.
And checks and balances that you have in place that allow you not to be completely alone in that decision. So there are others that are overseeing you to check with you that that's actually the right thing to do. Yeah.
And I think, you know, in terms of respecting expertise, I mean, when you're in an organisation like ours where you employ some of the world's great, you will know from the university, you know, you're surrounded by people who are world-renowned experts in their field. You know, you would be mad not to ask the question.
Yeah. And that diversity of thinking thought, you mentioned cultural diversity, seems also to be really important to you in terms of getting as many different perspectives, particularly on complex decisions, that you can before the decision is made, correct? I mean, I think that was one of the things that emerged from what you've been saying.
Yeah, and I think it's been really interesting because, of course, one of the trends at the moment is the kind of public debate about contested heritage. And I think the museum already has one of the reasons I think there was a conversation about Churchill. And actually, we did a review of the Churchill war rooms, and actually, we are quite balanced about Churchill. And I think that's what we've managed to achieve, is that, you know, sort of even with a victory narrative, which is what we have particularly in the First and the Second World War, we've managed to create characters that are balanced and have kind of full, it's why we do full life interviews for oral history, because we don't want to just have, you know, that person in 2 weeks in Burma or etc. So I think all of that complexity around sensitivity around building balanced narratives is again part of that ethical framework, but it also means then that there is a natural way to use expertise in the organization that I think other organizations don't naturally have. So I think I have a bit of an advantage in being able to make that work.
I see what you mean. Diane, thank you so much for that. As ever, we're up against our time. I mean, it's another subject we talk endlessly about, but Diane, we'll draw it to a close there, and it just remains for me actually formally to thank you on behalf of the TEDA Leadership Academy and the Lincoln International Business School for your insights over the last 20 minutes or so. Thank you so much for your contribution.
It's my pleasure. It was a very quick 20 minutes.
It certainly is, isn't it? Thank you so much, Diane.